help. So what both Haftorahs, okay, let's start with the first Haftorah. The first Haftorah is from the prophet Zechariah, one of the later prophets. Chapter 14, it's the conclusion of his book. And the beginning of the Haftorah is quite, I guess in some sense, it's quite violent. There's a description of a great war that many nations will come to the Jewish people, surround the Jewish people, surround Jerusalem, capture Jerusalem, and at that point, God will intervene, and in a miraculous way, there will be a miraculous victory for the Jewish people, as the prophet describes, and the people who came to battle the Jewish people will be destroyed to some degree, and then perhaps the connection to the holiday is that the second half of the Haftorah discusses what's going to be the aftermath of the war. So the aftermath of the war is going to be that everybody, all the nations will come up to Jerusalem to bow to Hashem. And it's a description of the temple in Jerusalem being a spiritual capital for the entire world. And it discusses how there'll be so many people in Jerusalem because all the nations arrive. And that's the poetic description. When we read the verses, is very beautiful. And that's the connection to Sukkot. But the question then becomes, why is Sukkot unique unique from the holidays that in the future, after the war, in other words, in the end of days, when the nations of the world are going to serve Hashem, specifically, they're going to come to Jerusalem of all the holidays, specifically on Sukkot. By the way, one of the most famous verses in the prophets, and it's famous because in the liturgy, we say it, I would say 3 times a day, every day of the year. The end of Aleinu. The verse says, V'haya Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz. God will be, the Lord will be the king of the entire earth. On that day, Hashem will be one, and his name will be one. That's a verse that we say at the conclusion of Aleinu. And if you go to any shul, any cantor, they like to sing it. V'nemar v'haya Hashem. That comes from this verse, this Haftorah, chapter 9, as we will see. In other words, at the end of days, Hashem will be one. Everybody will recognize God, the God of the Jewish people. And the expression of this recognition of God and the service of God is specifically in the holiday of Sukkot. So that tells us something about Sukkot, that Sukkot is, I would say it's a universal holiday. If you look at Passover, Passover is the holiday that's unique to the Jewish people. That's when God comes and takes the people out of Egypt. It's not a holiday of liberation for the Egyptians. It's a holiday for the liberation for the Jewish people. So it's specifically for the Jewish people. Then you have the holiday of Sukkot, which Sukkot is more universal. And where do we see this in the Torah? So first of all, the Sukkot is the season of the rain, and all nations understand that they need the rain. And in fact, we know even though Rosh Hashanah is the first of Tishrei, we celebrated it 2 weeks ago, but the Mishnah says that there are 4 Rosh Hashanahs. There are 4 New Years for 4 different matters. And the Mishnah says that Bechag, on the holiday of Sukkot, is the judgment for water. And water is something that's universal, so Sukkot is universal. There's another allusion to this. If you look at the offerings that they offered in the temple on Sukkot, so every holiday has a unique number of offerings and a unique different species of animals and different numbers. And the commentators, beginning from the Medrash, try to explain what's the significance of these numbers and these species. And when you get to the holiday of Sukkot, it's interesting because every day there's a different amount of offerings, and there are a total of 70 bulls that are offered. I believe we begin at 14, then 13, then 12, and then 11, etc., etc. So, and a total of 70. And the Talmud explains why do we offer 70 bulls? The reason why we offer 70 bulls, it is to atone for and to include and to pray for all the 70 nations. In the ancient world, we understood that there are 70 nations, and from the perspective of Judaism, actually, so there are 70 nations, and all nations that we have today branch out of those, spiritually speaking, branch out of those 70 nations. So already in the Torah, you see that there's a specific emphasis on Sukkot for the nations of the world. And the same concept is in the Haftorah, that when Mashiach comes, after the war, the terrible war. Now the commentaries explain this war is not named in this Haftorah in Zechariah, but Rashi and other commentaries say that the prophet Yecheskel, the prophet Ezekiel, names a war of Gog Magog. In English, that's Armageddon, where God brings many nations to Jerusalem, to Israel, to battle, and that's where God is, and that's where they're punished, so to speak. So the Rashi says that the war Zechariah is talking about is the same war as the war of Gog and Magog, the terrible war that's going to be at the end of days. And the aftermath of that war is that the nations that remain are going to serve Hashem, and specifically on Sukkot. Now there are some miraculous things that take place during the war, and we'll talk about that, and we will see that some of those are literal, some of those are figurative, and we will maybe go through it a little bit and see some of those details, and then we'll move on to the second Haftorah of the second day of Sukkot, which is a total different theme from a total different book, much earlier in history, but that should be interesting as well. So that's the introduction. Now we begin our journey. If anybody has any comments or jokes or questions, please go ahead. Otherwise we continue. Okay, so we'll read it quickly. The prophet describes that Jerusalem will be conquered, and then that's when the victory comes about. And it's interesting because there are people who are, especially in Israel, who are reading these Haftorahs and are trying to apply it to modern day events. So they're looking at it from modern day events, and I'll mention one or two things that they say. I'm not sure I agree or I don't agree, or it's true, it's not true, if Zechariah was talking about it or wasn't talking about it, but I'm going to just mention it for the sake of giving the full picture. So I'm reading Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1. Behold, a day of the Lord is coming, and your plunder shall be sheared within you. So if there's plunder, it means that the enemies overtook Jerusalem. The verse continues, number 2. And I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to wage war, and the city shall be captured, and the houses shall be plundered, and the women shall be ravished, and half the city shall go forth into exile, and the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. So there's a description where the city is conquered, and half the city goes to exile. Verse 3, now Hashem gets involved in a miraculous way. And the Lord shall go forth and wage war with those nations, like the day he waged war on the day of the battle. The verse continues, 4, and on that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem, from the east. And the Mount of Olives shall split in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west, a very great valley, and half the mountain shall move to the north, and half of it to the south. So you have a description here. Again, I don't know if it's literal or figurative, but the Mount of Olives splits. The Mount of Olives is a mountain that's outside Jerusalem. It is probably the oldest Jewish cemetery, not the oldest, Hebron is the oldest, but a very old Jewish cemetery. And the reason why the tradition was that they did not bury people in Jerusalem because of the holiness of the city. So they buried people on the Mount Olives that is right outside of Jerusalem, outside the old city of Jerusalem. And of course, it's still a functioning, what do they call it? Cemetery, if you can get a plot there. But in any case, the mountain splits. And you shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach Azal, and you shall flee as you fled because of the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, the king of Judah, and the Lord my God shall come, all holy ones with you. In other words, it's a description of, just like there was a famous earthquake in the days of the kings, in the days of Uzziah, the king of Yehuda, and similarly, there's going to be a similar earthquake, and that's going to tip the scale of the war. And it shall come to pass on that day that there shall be no light, only disappearing light and thick darkness. And it shall be on that, it shall be one day that this, verse 7, and it shall be one day that shall be known to the Lord, neither day nor night, and it shall come to pass that at the eventide it shall be light. So this is a strange verse. It will be a day known to the Lord. It will be lo yom. It will be neither day nor night, but it shall be like the evening, eventide. And that is a description. So I don't know what that sounds like. Maybe it sounds like nuclear war. There's no more light. You can't see the sunlight. It's not morning. It's not night. It's evening time. The verse continues. Again, I'm going to try to offer as much commentary as I could. I'm not promising much, but we'll see what we can make of this. Verse 8. So now, once the Mount Olive splits, now there's a description of a spring coming forth from Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass on that day that spring water shall come forth from Jerusalem, half of it to the eastern sea, and half of it to the western sea. In summer and in winter it shall be. If you go to Israel, there are a lot of streams that are specifically streams in the winter when there is rain, but in the summer they dry up. So here the verse says, the river will flow forth from Jerusalem, and it's going to be both winter and summer. Now what's interesting about this water is it's going to encompass the entire world. It's going to go both to the east and to the west. So it's going to go, half of it will go to the Yam HaKadmoni, to the eastern sea. Eastern Sea is the Red Sea, and from the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, and from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And then the Eastern Sea, and then the Western Sea is the Mediterranean Sea, and from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. So you have a description of water flowing from Jerusalem to the entire world. Now, that is not only water. The water can also be figurative. So when you say water, water is life. Life could be spiritual life as well. And that's why immediately after verse 8, that says that the living water will flow from Jerusalem, the verse continues to the spiritual influence of Jerusalem on the rest of the world. And that's verse 9. And that's the verse that I said is a very famous verse because we say it 3 times a day. And the Lord shall become king over all of the earth. On that day shall the Lord be one and his name one. He is one and his name is one. And there's a lot to say about this verse, but maybe we'll save it for later. And then we have a description, a strange description, that because of this earthquake, all the mountains around Jerusalem become a valley, become flattened, and Jerusalem is the only mountain. Now, you can read this literally, or you can read it figuratively, which means the only high place is Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's influence flows downward to the rest of Israel and the rest of the world, which is a metaphoric plain. That's verse 10. The whole earth shall be changed to be like a plain from the hill of Rimmon in the south of Jerusalem, but it, Jerusalem, will be elevated high and remain in its old place from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the first gate until the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel until the king's wine cellars. In other words, it's giving the borders of Jerusalem that will remain elevated. And then you have a description of, I don't know, this sounds like nuclear war, and it shall be the plague, and it shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite all the nations who besiege Jerusalem. His flesh will waste away while he still stands on his feet. His eyes will waste away in their sockets, and his tongue shall waste away in its mouth. And it will come to pass on that day that there will be great consternation sent by the Lord upon them. Each one shall seize the hand of the other, and his hand shall rise up against the hand of the other. In other words, they are infighting, which is always good for us. Yet ye, even Judah, will fight against Jerusalem, and the wealth of all nations round about gold and silver, and apparel will be gathered in very great abundance. And not only the people will suffer, but also the animals that came, again, the animal, the ancient world, the horse is like the tank. So not only will the people be smitten, but also the animals, which represent the warfare, represent the armies. That is 15. And so will be the plague of the horses, the mules, and the camels, and donkeys, and all the animals that are in those camps, similar to this plague. Okay, fine. So that's the negative part of the Haftorah. Again, what do we have till now? We have that there's going to be Jerusalem is conquered. Half the city goes to exile. Hashem intervenes. When Hashem intervenes, the description of the intervention is that somehow or another, the mountain splits, water flows from Jerusalem to the rest of the world, knowledge flows from Jerusalem, right? We say, B'haya Hashem, knowledge of God flows from Jerusalem to the rest of the world, and there's retribution for the nations that came to battle Jerusalem. Now we discuss the aftermath. What's going to happen with the nations of the world after Gog and Magog, after this terrible war? And the description is they're all going to come to Jerusalem specifically for Sukkot. And then there's the punishment for those who don't come to Sukkot, and then the description of Jerusalem on Sukkot when everybody is there. So we're going to read a little bit more, and then maybe that's just the overview. In other words, read the verses, and then maybe we'll give a little bit of insight in some of the verses. Okay, verse 16, and it will come to pass that everyone left of the nations who came up against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to prostrate himself to the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the festival of the tabernacles. In the Hebrew, lachog, to celebrate et Chag HaSukkot, the holiday of Sukkot. Now, and it shall be that whoever of all the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to prostrate himself to the King, the Lord of hosts, upon them there shall be no rain. Remember, we mentioned earlier that rain on the holiday of Sukkot is when we are judged for rain. And that's why we actually pray for rain on Shmini Atzeret, the final day of Sukkot. Really, we should have started earlier, but we don't want it to rain on Sukkot, so we wait for the final day of Sukkot. But that's the connection here. You see the prophet is connecting. Anybody who doesn't come to prostrate himself, to come to God and bow in Jerusalem, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and does not come, it shall not rain upon them. The plague on Egypt will be the same as that which the Lord will plague the nations who do not go up to celebrate the festival of the tabernacles. In other words, there's a technicality in Jerusalem. In Egypt, they don't need rain. So you need a different punishment other than holding back rain, because Egypt has the Nile. So there'll be a plague for those people who don't come up for the Sukkot. 19, such will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the festival of the tabernacles. And now, a beautiful description. There's going to be so many people in Jerusalem that the description is very beautiful. There's not going to be a pot in all of Jerusalem, because all the pots will be taken to the temple to offer, to cook the offerings. And there's not going to be any bells on the horses, because all the metals are going to be taken to be made vessels for the temple, because there's going to be so many people coming to the temple. So the vessels that we have is not going to be sufficient. That's verse 20 and 21. On that day there will be upon the bells of the horses holy. On that day there will be upon the bells of the horses holy to the Lord. In other words, they're going to write holy to the Lord on the bells of the horses. And the pots in the house of the Lord will be like the sprinkling bowls before the altar. In other words, that they're going to take the vessels from the horses, the bells from the horses, and make those pots and sprinkle bowls, because in the temple they would take the blood from the animal and sprinkle it on the altar. They needed a vessel, so they're going to have to go and take those bells from the horses, which is this is a poetic scene. It's multi-layered, of course. Well, hopefully we'll get to it. Every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts, and all who sacrifice will come and take of them and cook in them. And there will no longer be a trafficker in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. Trafficker, I don't know why they translate it. Kanani means a merchant. There'll be no more merchants in the temple or around the temple in Jerusalem, because everyone in Jerusalem is going to be totally and completely focused on the service of Hashem. So that's the big picture of the Haftorah. Now to think about some of the specific details. So one way, let's start at the end. One way to think about it is that the prophet is talking about a technicality. There's going to be so many people coming to the temple, so they're going to need all the pots in Jerusalem to serve in the temple. So if you're going to want to make chicken soup in your house, you're not going to have a pot to make chicken soup, because they're going to take the pot to serve in the temple. That's one interpretation. I guess that's a simple interpretation. And in that sense, this is a description of the many people who come to Jerusalem. But there's also a more of a mystical interpretation, and that is that the way the prophet is describing Jerusalem, you see that there's no division between the holy and the mundane, right? Up till now, in what characterizes the world before the Mashiach comes, is that there's holy and there's domain. There's the time when you're at home and you're eating dinner, or like he says in the last verse, you're a Knaani, which means a merchant. You have your own private business. You're doing your own thing, and there's a sort of a distinction and a separation between holy and mundane. When Mashiach comes, because he says the entire earth will be permeated with the knowledge of God, he says on that day Hashem will be one and his name will be one. Everybody will recognize the holiness of Hashem. So holiness really affects every part of life. So even in your pot when you're eating dinner at home, it's felt, you feel it as a holy experience of serving God. So it's talking about, it's not just the technicality that they're not going to have enough pots in Jerusalem, but it represents a transformation that the division between mundane and holy that we experience in the world, the way we experience it today before the redemption, that division, that sort of artificial division is wiped away. So that's one point to mention. Another point to mention is that you have the transformation. In the ancient world, you have the Torah is very concerned what happens if Egypt doesn't come up to celebrate on Sukkot. Egypt gets its own mention. Who's Egypt? Egypt is one of the superpowers of the time. We know that Egypt was the source of producing war horses. In fact, in the Torah says that the king may not have too many horses, because if he has too many horses, then he'll be enticed to go back to Jerusalem, to go back to Egypt to get good horses. And God doesn't want us going back to Egypt. So horses represents the physical might of the superpower. And the bell on the horse represents the music, represents it's here to by having an army is not enough. You also have to have a parade, right? Because you need your enemy. Why do armies parade their troops down the street? If they have if they have Independence Day or whatever, because it's not enough to have an army. It's important that people understand and know it and are afraid of it, and they're impressed by your might. So that's why the horses, which is the ancient world, they're the tanks. They're the vehicles of warfare. The tanks also have bells, because the point is you have to draw attention to the bell. So the bells of the horses represents the physical might of the superpower. And what's happening here is when Mashiach comes, is a complete transformation. The might of the superpower is actually transformed to serve in the temple. In other words, all technology, all human brilliance and human innovation is actually here and serves to advance holiness and goodness, and that's a description of what will happen when the Mashiach comes. Now, because we mentioned the verse 9 every day in the prayer 3 times, so let's talk about it just for a minute. And the Lord shall become king over all of the earth. On that day shall the Lord be one and his name one. So it's interesting that this connects to the Shema. The most important Jewish prayer is Shema. What does Shema mean? Shema Yisrael. Hear, O Israel. The Lord is our one. The Lord is our God. The Lord is one. Why hear, O Israel? Why just Israel? Why not the rest of the world? I thought God is one. So if he's one, he's the king of the entire world. So Rashi explains that verse is not the goal. The verse Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, is Moshe is talking to the present time. The present time, only the Israel is listening. Israel is the Jewish people, or the people who are joining the Jewish people. The people on the spiritual state of Israel are listening and paying attention to the fact that Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem is our God. What does it mean he's our God? He's our God and not the neighbor's God? No, he's our God, meaning we recognize his sovereignty. Other people don't recognize his sovereignty, so he's not their God. Again, it's a subjective thing. It's not an objective thing. When you say God is God, it doesn't mean you're not affecting him. He's the creator, right? He doesn't need us to become the God. But when you say that he's our God, it means we recognize him as such. So Rashi explains the verse, Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, Hashem Elokeinu. Now, in the present time, the Lord is our God. But eventually, in the end of days, Hashem Echad, Hashem will be one, and everyone will recognize him. And Rashi quotes this verse. So this verse, Bayom Ahu Yiyeh, on that day, V'haya Hashem the Melech, God will be the king on the entire earth. On that day, Hashem will be one, and his name will be one. that is the continuation to the Shema. The Shema is the way it is in the time of exile. In other words, pre-Mashiach, pre-knowledge of God spreading to the entire world. And then, eventually, we'll have this verse of Zechariah, where the oneness of Hashem will be not just for the Jewish people. In other words, not just the Jewish people will recognize it, but everybody will recognize it. Now, what does it mean? Hashem will be one, and his name will be one. What does it mean? Now he has two names. So the difference, Hashem, name in the Torah, when we think about God's name means the way God expresses himself. And when the way God expresses himself, we don't see the oneness, because we see at least plurality. We look around the world, we see both good and bad. We see holiness and we see unholiness. So even though Hashem is one, in other words, we believe that the truth of the matter is that all reality comes from God. And therefore, God is one. There's no two sources of reality. But his name, the way he expresses himself, the way God's power to create expresses himself, we don't see oneness. We see plurality. We see good and bad. And we see multiplicity. And we see division. We don't see the oneness. When you say his name will be one, you're saying not only is it true that Hashem was one, but also his name, the way he expresses himself, will be one. We'll be able to detect and see Hashem's oneness. When Mashiach comes, it will be obvious to us. And that's the meaning of not only is he one, but his name is one as well. So that is the conclusion of the general ideas on the first Haftorah. And we have one more Haftorah quickly to discuss, which is the second day. But in the meantime, if anybody wants to comment, please go ahead. And otherwise, we will go to the second Haftorah of the second day. I'm wondering if, maybe just a second, I want to see if I can. Maybe there's a way I can share the screen. If there's a way to do that, that may be fun. Okay, we'll try that next time. Okay, I think it might. You would think, what are we, 7 months into Corona, I would figure out the technology. No, not yet. Okay, second day of the Haftorah. We go back to the Book of Kings. So if you talk about the Haftorah of Zechariah, Zechariah is the end of the first temple. And almost 400 years earlier, we read about the first Haftorah begins almost 400 years, 420 years earlier. It's the inauguration of the temple by Solomon. So King Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, and he brings the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark with the Torah laid, with the tablets laid. Again, there were two sets of tablets. The first set Moshe broke, and the second set was complete. The second tablets that we received on Yom Kippur, both of those tablets, both the complete tablets and the broken tablets, were in the Ark. And the Ark, if you read the book of Judges, from when the Jewish people entered the land, it went to different places. There were tabernacles, temporary temples in different places. One time it was even captured by the Philistines until they sent it back because it was causing too much trouble. And eventually King David decides that he has to build a place for the Ark, and he tries to bring it up to Jerusalem. There's a story there. In any case, then they plan the temple. King Solomon, David's son, builds the temple, and they inaugurate the temple, and they bring the Ark into the temple, and they bring the Ark into the temple, and the divine presence dwells in the temple. And at that point, the Jewish people, King Solomon makes a beautiful prayer of how he prays that God should continue dwelling in the temple. Okay, why are we reading this on Sukkot, on the second day of Sukkot? So the answer is that this story actually happened on Sukkot. In other words, the time that Solomon brought the ark into the temple was on Sukkot. Solomon there was really a 2-week inauguration period for the temple. It started actually before Yom Kippur, and it lasted till the end of Sukkot. In fact, the commentaries explain, and the Medrash explains, that the Jewish people, that year was the year the Jewish people, because of the great intense joy of the inauguration of a temple, they actually did not fast on Yom Kippur, which is astonishing. And it says afterward, the prophet told Solomon not to worry because God didn't forgive. God was happy that they did so because this event was so monumental that the event of creating the temple and having a divine presence dwell in the temple, that it actually overrides Yom Kippur. So that's why we read it on Sukkot, because King Solomon builds his temple on Sukkot. Brings the ark to the temple on Sukkot, and that's when the divine presence dwells in the temple. Okay, wonderful. Now we know why we read it on Sukkot. But you want to dig a little deeper. Why, of all the periods of the year, did King Solomon build his temple, choose to inaugurate the temple on Sukkot? Right? So in other words, we understand, we read this Haftorah on Sukkot because that's when Solomon decided to bring the ark to the temple. But the question is, why did he decide so? And knowing why he decided so will give us insight to what Sukkot is and what the temple is. So the theory is as follows. It's not mine. I read it elsewhere, but this is what some people think. So if you think about Solomon, Solomon was very politically aware. In other words, Solomon was in Solomon's times, Jerusalem and the Jewish people reached the height of their greatness. In other words, they were very popular. There were no wars, and all the nations of the earth wanted to come and do business with Solomon and make political connections with Solomon. We know that the Queen of Sheba who comes, and there are all kinds of stories of the influence of Solomon reaching the farthest areas of the known world at the time. And this was very important to Solomon because Solomon understood that the purpose of the Jewish people is not just to serve Hashem, serve God themselves, but also to spread the knowledge of God to the rest of the world, which is why Solomon has so many wives. If you understand the history of the monarchs, when a monarch marries another woman, he's really marrying into another culture. And in some way, it's a way of solidifying and making peace treaties with that other culture. We know that Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh, which that created all kinds of problems later on because the question was when they converted, but they weren't sincere, and ultimately they started serving idols. So there are all kinds of side effects, some positive, some negative. But we understand that it's very clear that Solomon's mind frame, Solomon understands that his responsibility is to influence the nations. And therefore he marries so many women because he's interacting with so many cultures, because he wants to influence the cultures. Problem is when you try to influence the cultures, they also influence you. You have to be very careful how you go about doing so. But that was Solomon's mind frame. Now, that's why Solomon sees the temple not as a temple that's unique for the Jewish people, right? He sees the temple as a temple that, in the language of the other prophets that we evoke in the high holidays, who say, Beiti Beit Tfilah, my house is a house of prayer, Yikareh will be called for all the nations. Solomon understands that the temple is supposed to be a place of spiritual influence for the entire world. By the way, this was very different than the tabernacle, than the Mishkan. The Mishkan represents the concept of the unique relationship between God and the Jewish people, right? The Jewish people come out of Egypt. In other words, Passover is more of a holiday specific for the Jewish people. And the Mishkan, when God dwells in the tabernacle that the Jewish people built in the desert. What does the desert represent? The Jewish people are in the desert and they're experiencing miracles from Hashem. It's a unique relationship between God and the Jewish people, an intimate relationship. And that is what the Mishkan represents, the tabernacle represents. And therefore, that was unique. But then when King Solomon wants to build a temple and shift the focus, so to speak, it's not only a place where the Jew finds intimacy with God, but it's also a place that will influence the rest of the world. That's Solomon's vision. Ultimately, that's Judaism's vision. Therefore, it's no accident that the holiday where he chooses to bring the ark into the temple, which then brings about the divine presence resting in the temple, is when? On Sukkot. And we said of all the holidays, Sukkot is the universal holiday. Passover is unique to the Jews, Sukkot is universal. So Solomon choosing the time of the inauguration of the temple is actually signaling his vision for the temple and his vision for what the temple is, which is really his vision for what Judaism is. So this wasn't an accident that it happened specifically in a temple. This was an expression of Solomon's idea of the function and the purpose of the temple. Okay, so that's an introduction. Maybe we'll take a few minutes. We'll read a few of the verses, and then we will either make a comment or two or call it a day. We'll see. So I'm reading Kings, Book of Kings 1, chapter 8, verse 2. And all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon at the feast of the month of Etanim, which is the 7th month. The month of Etanim was the name of the month initially. Etanim literally means the strong ones. The commentaries explain that it's called the month of Etanim because that's when the strong ones is the sort of the pillars of the earth were born. That was the month that the patriarchs were born in. But then after the Torah was given, the Torah refers to it as the 7th month. So this verse gives both names, the month of Etanim and the 7th month. And the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. And they brought up the ark of the Lord, and the tabernacle of meeting, and all the holy vessels which were in the tabernacle. And the priests and the Levites did bring them up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel that were assembled unto him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be counted nor numbered for multitude. There were so many, there's no number to the amount of offerings offered on that day. Verse 6, and the priests brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place, into the sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim, so that they placed the ark in its place in the Holy of Holies. For the cherubim spread forth their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim covered the ark, and the staves thereof above. So I don't want to go into this whole details right now, but if you know the ark was a box, and on top of the ark there was a covering, and of the covering there emerged two cherubim. Cherubim is sort of either angels or children with wings covering over the ark. So there was the ark and the cherubim on top. Solomon, in addition to that, Solomon made in his Holy of Holies, he made cherubim, he made those figures of angels emerging from the earth, not from the ark. And they were taller than the ark. So the cherubim of Solomon covered and hovered over and covered the cherubim which covered the ark, if you see what I'm saying. So there was the ark and the cherubim on top, and in addition there were cherubim from the floor covering, and that's what verse 7 is discussing. And the staves were so long that the ends of the staves were seen from the holy place before the sanctuary, and they were not seen without, and they are there unto this day. There was nothing in the ark save the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel. They came out of the land of Egypt. Of course, Horeb is Sinai. Verse 10, and it came to pass, when the priests came out of the holy place, and the cloud filled the house of the Lord. That's the sign of divine presence. There's very interesting parallels between the description of these verses and the description at the final verses of the second book of the Torah, the book of Exodus, where we also have where Moshe concludes the building of a tabernacle and the divine presence dwells within the tabernacle. Again, the cloud fills the house. Okay, when you have a chance, you can continue reading it. You read about the divine presence dwelling. You also read about the prayer that King Solomon prays after the divine presence dwells there. I just want to make one point, and that is that, again, if you want to compare this to the dwelling of the divine presence in the time of Moshe, when the divine presence dwells in the times of Moshe in the tabernacle, there's a very similar description. The divine presence dwells, and the cloud filled the house of the Lord. And then look at verse 11. The verse 11 says, and the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. This is almost exactly the verse that comes from the end of the book of Exodus. It says, "V'lo yachol Moshe." Moshe was not able to be in the tent of in the cloud of glory, in the tent of meeting, because the cloud rested upon it. And so the same thing that happened to Moshe now happens to the priests in the days of Solomon. So I'm reading literally the last page of the second book of the Torah. I'm just going to read it right here, verse 34. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Hashem filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting, for the cloud rested upon it, and the glory of Hashem filled the tabernacle. So there are similarities between both stories, how Hashem's presence dwells in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and how Hashem's, hundreds of years later, how Hashem's presence dwells in the temple. But there's one important difference. The important difference is that when you read the book of Exodus, the people are passive. The people didn't do much. They built a tabernacle, of course, but then the divine presence comes by itself. Here is a different description. Here the description is that people have to participate. The people were offering many sacrifices. And not only do they prepare before, but also after the divine presence dwells. In the book of Exodus, Moshe is silent. In the book of Kings, King Solomon gives a whole speech, gives two prayers, and it continues, and there's great celebration. And this perhaps represents the shift of the state of the spiritual state of the Jewish people in the desert and once they come into Israel. In the desert, the people are much more passive because God takes them out of Egypt. God performs the miracles. They don't really have to do much. Once they enter Israel, because they're sustained on miracles in the desert, once they enter Israel, there's a shift. Here, God waits for the people to be involved, to participate. And therefore, think about the history of the Temple Mountain itself, right? The people were the ones who selected the place of where the temple is going to be. And the people are the ones who are much more active in the process of the divine presence dwelling amongst the Jewish people. They're offering offerings. King Solomon responds with prayer after the divine presence dwells. It's much more of a relationship, a two-way street relationship, where the Jewish people are much more involved in the relationship than it was when they first left Egypt and they were less spiritually mature. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a story in short. I hope that we have at least a taste of the Haftorah. There's a lot more going on here, a lot to say, but I think this is it for now. If anybody has any comments or questions, please share. I'm not promising to know the answer, but please share. And otherwise, we should see each other in good health, in good health, and we should enjoy the preparations for the holiday of Sukkot, which reminds us that we're supposed to not only influence ourselves, but influence the rest of the world as well.
Rabbi?